Being as how Joseph Smith situated Christ and his life and atonement as the centerpiece of the gospel to which everything else is an appendage, then it would stand to reason that the restoration has to provide us with a radically different understanding of Christ and his role. Because if that was already intact and didn't need correction, then the restoration itself would have been redundant. And so it behooves us to study deeply to figure out exactly what is radically new, what is radically improved and enhanced in our understanding of Jesus Christ and his role. If, in fact, it was the design of our heavenly parents that Eve eat of the fruit, and that we, therefore, enter into this process of mortality universally, well, then that radically shifts the role of Christ as compared to how traditional Christianity sees his role. In all standard narratives of the Christian story, what happens in Eden is a disaster, it's a catastrophe, and Christ intervenes as a repairman to rescue a bad situation. But we reject that whole premise. Christ is not just a brilliant repairman. He, in fact, has to rather participate as the great architect behind the entire process. And as Fiona said, the point of what happens in Eden doesn't seem to be so much that sin is introduced into the world, as it is that mortality and everything attendant upon mortality is introduced into the world. And we saw that the angel characterized our mortality in these latter days principally not as immersed in sin, but as immersed in blindness and in woundedness. And if that's the case, then it would make more sense to characterize Christ as the healer of a wounded humanity rather than the rescuer of a damned race. Now, I want to take you through just a few examples of where Christ ministers in the New Testament, in his ministry, and a word that is most often associated with the work of Christ. In Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is approached by a woman who is hemorrhaging blood, and nobody has been able to remedy her ailment. Christ heals the woman, and in the words of Matthew, the woman is therefore made whole. The Greek word that Matthew is using here is sozo, and sozo is a Greek term that generally means to improve the health of, to make whole, to heal. When healing is taking place in the New Testament, the word that is most commonly employed is sozo. Christ sozos the hemorrhaging woman, so to speak. In Luke chapter 18, the afflicted individual in this case is a blind man, and Christ similarly cures the blind man of his affliction. And what is the verb that is employed? Sozo. Jesus sozos. He heals the blind man of his affliction. And the next example, in Mark chapter 5, there's a girl who has apparently died. She's rendered at least unconscious from the plague, and Jesus restores her to life and vitality. Well, guess what the verb that is used here is? Jesus sozos, right? He restores to life. He heals the girl who's struck by the plague. In the book of Acts, in chapters 3 and 4, we are exposed to what is the first general sermon given in the post-resurrection world. Peter and John are journeying to the temple, and they encounter a paralytic. And that paralytic asks for alms. Peter gives him no alms, but offers instead to heal him, which he does. And then in Acts chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, we find this description. And I want you to look very, very carefully at what's happening in this language, because I think it has tremendous implications for how we understand the Christ. I'm going to quote first from the left-hand column, which is John Wycliffe. Now, this is significant because John Wycliffe is the first translator of the Bible into English. And most importantly, he is translating before the Reformation. And that's important because what the Reformation does is the Reformation solidifies, it concretizes most of those deviations from the gospel that were introduced by Augustine. As a Protestant Reformation really solidified all of those teachings which are very, very hostile to the gospel as we understand it in the Restoration, including the necessity for priesthood, for ordinances, for free agency. So John Wycliffe translates this scene as follows: if we today be deemed in the good deed of a sick man, in whom this man is made soph. Now, soph is a Middle English word, and it means healed. Okay, so this man is healed. Be it known to you all that in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, this man standeth whole before you. And now he announces what I take to be the central principle of the gospel, as the original apostles of Jesus Christ understood it. Neither is there other name under heaven given to men in which it behooveth us to be made soph. So Peter essentially has in these words distilled the essence of the gospel to one idea, that every man, woman, and child is wounded. We are in need of healing. We need to be made whole. And it is through our faith in Jesus Christ that we can be made whole. But notice what happens when we get to the first Protestant translation, which we use now, King James Version. If we this day be examined of the good deed done to the impotent man, by what means he is made whole, accurate enough, be it known unto you all that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth does this man stand here before you whole, because it's the same word, sozo. Neither is there salvation. Suddenly we've introduced this idea of salvation, which would not have, I don't think, made much sense to a Jewish audience who has just watched a man be healed, and suddenly we're talking about salvation, when the original language and context clearly emphasize that this is about healing. And so Tyndale introduces this alternate reading: there is none other name given under heaven among men whereby we must be saved. Now, why am I making so much of this translation decision? Well, it's because in the Protestant world, as this concept develops, salvation is the antithesis of damnation. And so we begin with a fallen world, a sinful world inhabited by depraved individuals, and we need to be rescued from hell. That's what salvation means. But in the original usage of the term, and in Joseph Smith's restored message, we inhabit a world in order to experience a variety of tests and trials and tribulations that leave us injured and wounded, and we turn to Christ for our healing. Turning to the very first prophecy of the coming Christ given us in the Gospels, and it's in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. The prophecy is, and she shall bring forth, speaking of the Virgin Mary, she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall, and in Greek, the word is, he shall sozo his people from their sins. And so I would ask you, how would you render that verb, sozo? I would suggest that we might think of it as a prophecy of a coming Christ who will bring healing in his wings, as Isaiah prophesied. It constitutes a beautiful symmetry to the condition of woundedness that Nephi describes in the Book of Mormon, which is addressed by a healer who comes into the world. Fiona and I have been delighted to see that in recent general conferences especially, there has been a noticeable uptick in the language and rhetoric of healing that we have heard from the mouths of our own prophets and apostles. One of our favorite examples comes from Elder Renland, who 2 or 3 conferences ago adopted this very metaphor as a way of redefining our relationship to Christ. He said, as the good shepherd Jesus views disease in his sheep as a condition that needs treatment, care, and compassion, this shepherd, our good shepherd, finds joy in seeing his diseased sheep progress toward healing.
Annotated and summarized, easy to share with loved ones. The description below the title for this video has these summary points.